Welcome back to the channel, everyone. If you're ready for an emotional roller coaster about massive regrets, hidden secrets, and the powerful journey of a man desperately trying to earn back the family he threw away, you are in the exact right place. Before we dive into this unforgettable story of redemption, please subscribe to our channel, hit that like button, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's get into the CEO's second chance. The CEO's second chance. A costly mistake. He aggressively demanded a brutal abortion and ruthlessly walked away. Exactly 2 agonizing years later, the multimillionaire CEO stood completely paralyzed, staring in pure shock at his identical twin daughters in the middle of a crowded shopping mall. Ethan Reiner had meticulously built his entire, massive life entirely on absolute control. The exact kind of highly rigid, unbreakable discipline that left absolutely zero room for pathetic hesitation or weak compromise. As the highly feared global CEO of one of the absolute largest, most powerful corporations in the entire country, his terrifying name was entirely synonymous with pure, unadulterated power. His striking image was constantly projected across elite luxury magazines as the ultimate titan who flawlessly turned absolutely everything he touched into solid gold. He proudly wore his massive success exactly like impenetrable armor, and for agonizing years, he genuinely believed that specific armor was completely invincible. But when Catherine stood nervously right in front of him that fateful night, her soft hands violently trembling as she terrifyingly showed him the tiny plastic test, clearly displaying 2 unmistakable pink lines, he physically felt something massive violently crack directly beneath his highly polished surface. She desperately searched his handsome face for a microscopic drop of warmth, for gentle reassurance, desperately searching for the exact man she genuinely, foolishly believed truly loved her. Instead, she found absolutely nothing but freezing steel. His dark brown eyes, usually incredibly sharp with massive ambition, instantly turned as completely cold as solid stone. The highly suffocating silence aggressively stretched on in an incredibly unbearable manner until he finally spoke. His deep voice was incredibly low, but utterly, terrifyingly ruthless. "This is absolutely not the right time. You will aggressively take care of this immediately tomorrow morning. Absolutely zero discussions." Catherine violently shrank backward, exactly as if he had brutally, physically struck her across the face. She had naively thought that perhaps he would be massively surprised, maybe even highly upset at first. But deep down, she had desperately hoped he would miraculously reconsider. She hoped the beautiful idea of a biological child might somehow awaken something incredibly tender deep inside his cold soul. Instead, he aggressively treated the highly sensitive news exactly like a highly pathetic business problem that desperately needed to be swiftly, efficiently eradicated. He absolutely did not ask exactly how she felt. He did not sit with her in the massive, swirling hurricane of blinding fear and pure uncertainty. He simply, coldly issued a strict executive order, exactly as he would to a pathetic corporate employee who had just made a highly expensive, catastrophic mistake. His piercing gaze was incredibly distant, almost entirely bored, and in that exact, horrifying moment, Catherine profoundly realized the massive, terrifying depth of the unbridgeable abyss completely between them. Her beautiful voice violently trembled as she desperately tried to explicitly explain that this absolutely wasn't just a minor inconvenience, that there was actual, beautiful life miraculously growing directly inside her. that she absolutely could not simply reduce her innocent child to a pathetic, disposable corporate problem. She pathetically pleaded with him to look completely past his massive, multi-billion-dollar empire, past the highly curated, pristine public image he fiercely protected, and to genuinely see her, to truly see them, as something infinitely more valuable than absolute ruthless control. But absolutely every single, desperate word she uttered violently crashed directly against a massive, impenetrable wall of freezing silence and toxic indifference. Ethan's sharp jaw aggressively clenched, and he violently repeated himself, this time significantly sharper and infinitely crueler. Tomorrow. It was the absolute final word of a terrifying man, entirely accustomed to being blindly obeyed. The massive, highly explosive argument that violently followed completely, permanently destroyed whatever tiny, microscopic fragments remained of their incredibly fragile relationship. Catherine's hot tears absolutely did not move his cold heart. Her blinding, white-hot anger absolutely did not make him violently waver. She aggressively accused him of being entirely heartless, of cowardly hiding completely behind his massive fortune, because he was way too incredibly terrified to actually feel genuine human emotion. He coldly dismissed her highly accurate accusations with a freezing detachment that chilled her completely to the absolute bone. In his highly arrogant mind, he was fiercely protecting himself, aggressively severing highly toxic ties completely before they could violently trap him. Before the massive, terrifying vulnerability of fatherhood could successfully dismantle the massive empire he had brutally sacrificed absolutely everything to build. But in aggressively doing so, he completely, utterly failed to profoundly realize that he absolutely wasn't protecting himself at all. He was actively, permanently condemning himself to a highly suffocating, absolute loneliness that he wouldn't truly recognize until agonizing years significantly later. That exact night, Catherine rapidly packed all her personal belongings. She walked completely out without ever bothering to look back, aggressively clutching the grainy ultrasound photo she had happily taken that exact same day. She profoundly knew that he would absolutely never open his frozen heart. Not then. And absolutely not when it truly, genuinely mattered the most. She walked completely out of his massive luxury penthouse, leaving behind the highly polished marble surfaces and the gleaming floor-to-ceiling windows that perfectly reflected absolutely nothing but pure, unadulterated emptiness. And she stepped bravely into a highly terrifying world of absolute uncertainty. Her shattered heart was completely broken, but it beat fiercely in perfect rhythm, with the two tiny, fragile lives beautifully growing directly inside her. And she fiercely swore that she would aggressively protect them, no matter the massive, agonizing cost. Ethan stood completely frozen at the massive window long after she had permanently gone, intensely staring down at the glittering city lights, stretching infinitely far below. He arrogantly told himself that he had flawlessly done the absolute right thing, that she would incredibly thank him one day for miraculously saving them both from a massive, pathetic burden that neither of them was fully prepared to carry. He confidently poured himself an expensive drink, deeply convinced that he had aggressively made the highly rational, strong decision. However, somewhere incredibly deep, completely inside his dark soul, completely beneath the thick, heavy layers of toxic pride and arrogant certainty, a highly faint, terrifying unease aggressively stirred. He violently ignored it, just exactly as he violently ignored the unread, final text message she had sent him. Completely unaware that by cowardly turning his broad back that fateful night, He had aggressively turned his back on the absolute single future that could have ever miraculously made him completely whole. Ethan demanded she get rid of the babies. What would you do if your partner gave you such a cruel ultimatum? Tell us below. The struggle and the birth. Catherine's massive departure absolutely wasn't the highly dramatic, theatrical escape of a brave woman running joyfully toward absolute freedom. It was the incredibly silent, deeply painful retreat of a shattered woman who had been violently expelled from a beautiful life she genuinely thought was entirely hers. The massive city felt incredibly, significantly colder as she slowly walked down the freezing streets, securely clutching her cheap suitcase. Every single streetlight served exactly as a harsh, glaring reminder of the highly elite world she was permanently leaving behind. She possessed absolutely no massive plan, zero significant savings to speak of, and absolutely no family to desperately turn to. The absolute only valuable thing she carried entirely with her was the tiny, grainy, black and white ultrasound photo, meticulously, lovingly folded inside her cheap purse. The absolute, undeniable proof of the beautiful lives she fiercely refused to let him violently erase. Every single time her soft fingers gently touched it, her fierce determination aggressively hardened, even while blinding. Massive fear violently gripped her throat, with every single step she took further away from Ethan's imposing fortress of glass and cold steel. In the highly agonizing weeks that violently followed, her entire universe rapidly shrank to pure, unadulterated survival. She miraculously found a highly cheap, run-down rented room securely tucked away in a significantly dilapidated part of the massive city. The paper-thin walls were so incredibly cheap, she could clearly hear the highly toxic arguments and violently crying children of her struggling neighbors, but it was absolutely all she could possibly afford. She aggressively secured a grueling job at a tiny, highly depressing local grocery store, standing heavily behind the cheap cash register for agonizing hours every single day. Her painfully swollen ankles throbbed violently as the high-risk pregnancy rapidly advanced. The rude customers rarely ever looked directly into her exhausted eyes, and when they occasionally did, it was absolutely always with highly toxic impatience, rather than any microscopic ounce of basic human kindness. Still, she smiled beautifully whenever she possibly could, because the profound thought of the two beautiful lives, aggressively growing completely inside her, magically gave her a massive, unbreakable strength she never knew she actually possessed. She fiercely reminded herself that every single, grueling shift she exhausted, completed, every single, pathetic dollar she desperately saved, was an absolute solid brick in the heavy foundation of the brand new life she was aggressively building entirely for them. The high-risk twin pregnancy, however, was incredibly, brutally unforgiving. The long nights violently morphed into a massive, terrifying battle, completely against bone-crushing exhaustion and blinding fear. She often lay completely awake, staring blankly up at the heavily cracked, peeling ceiling of her cheap rented room, desperately, frantically wondering exactly how the hell she would successfully afford expensive medical care, how she would desperately buy highly expensive diapers or vital baby formula, exactly how she would successfully, fiercely raise two innocent children entirely alone. Sometimes, in the absolute darkest, most terrifying hours, her exhausted mind violently drifted directly back to Ethan, to the beautiful, pure warmth that had once genuinely existed completely between them, long before massive ambition and toxic pride had violently replaced true love. She highly agonizingly wondered if he absolutely ever thought about her. If he genuinely regretted the horrific, cruel way he had ruthlessly dismissed her, exactly as if she were absolutely nothing more than a highly pathetic corporate mistake. But then, she vividly remembered the freezing finality of his deep voice, the exact, terrifying way his piercing eyes had violently turned to absolute ice, and she profoundly knew the absolute, brutal answer. She absolutely could not pathetically depend on him. She would absolutely never, ever beg him again. Some heavily pitied her. Some heavily pitied her. Others aggressively, toxically judged her. But Catherine fiercely learned to completely, utterly ignore absolutely all of them. She confidently walked completely alone to every single one of her highly critical medical appointments, aggressively clutching her cheap, worn coat tightly around herself. She listened incredibly intently as the elite doctor explicitly explained the highly complex, dangerous complications of actively carrying twins. There were massive, highly real risks, and she profoundly knew it. But she nodded fiercely, with absolute, unbreakable firmness, explicitly telling the doctor that she would aggressively do absolutely whatever it took. Every single time the cold ultrasound wand smoothly glided entirely over her massive stomach, and she clearly, vividly, saw exactly 2 tiny, rapidly flickering heartbeats. Her chest violently filled with a massive, fierce, highly protective love that completely, instantly drowned out absolutely all of her blinding fear. These were her beautiful daughters, her absolute pure reason to simply breathe, and she would violently endure absolutely any horrific hardship to safely, miraculously bring them entirely into this world. When the exact day of the highly dangerous delivery finally arrived, it was absolute, unadulterated chaos. She was violently rushed completely into the massive hospital, her exhausted body entirely shattered by excruciating, blinding pain. Her sweating hands aggressively gripped the cold metal bed rails so incredibly tight that her knuckles turned pure, bone white. The bright, sterile room rapidly filled with chaotic, loud voices. Elite doctors aggressively barking strict medical orders. Exhausted nurses frantically moving incredibly fast. The highly rhythmic, terrifying beeping of the massive medical machines completely filling the heavy air. Catherine's blurred vision completely clouded with hot tears and crushing, pure exhaustion. But miraculously, entirely through the highly painful, thick haze, she clearly heard the beautiful cries. First one, then the absolute other, violently piercing the heavy air with absolute, pure, unadulterated life. They were gently, beautifully placed entirely into her exhausted arms. 2 incredibly tiny, fragile bodies, securely wrapped in perfectly soft, warm blankets. Their dark, beautiful hair slightly damp. Their massive, gorgeous eyes blinking heavily for the absolute very first time. She violently wept as she softly whispered fierce, unbreakable promises entirely to them. Massive promises that she would aggressively love them significantly more than enough for absolutely both parents. Fierce promises that she would absolutely never, ever let them feel violently abandoned. She beautifully named them Anna and Grace. 2 perfectly beautiful names she had softly, lovingly whispered entirely to them in the absolute quiet of her tiny rented room for agonizing months. Names that would now beautifully, permanently carry her massive, unbreakable hope entirely for the future. The exhausting weeks that rapidly followed were an absolute, chaotic blur of deeply sleepless nights and completely endless, highly demanding feedings. Catherine flawlessly learned to actively live entirely in tiny, fragmented moments. Brief, pathetic moments of desperate rest when the tiny girls finally, beautifully, closed their massive eyes. Highly quick, pathetic meals. Rapidly eaten completely cold because there was absolutely zero time to even properly heat them up. Her exhausted body violently ached. Her bloodshot eyes aggressively burned with pure exhaustion. But she miraculously found immense, pure joy entirely in the absolute smallest, most beautiful moments. Anna's absolute, very first, pure laugh. Grace's highly curious, intense gaze. The exact, beautiful way their incredibly tiny, soft hands tightly curled completely around her calloused finger. Those beautiful, simple moments were massive, priceless treasures, significantly greater than absolutely anything Ethan's massive, multi-billion-dollar fortune could have ever possibly bought. She proudly watched them grow with pure, unadulterated wonder, heavily marveling at exactly how their distinct, beautiful personalities aggressively began to miraculously emerge. Exactly how, even at such an incredibly young age, they beautifully reflected each other, yet remained so incredibly, beautifully distinct. There were definitely terrifying, agonizing nights when she completely broke down, violently overwhelmed by the massive, crushing weight of absolutely everything. When the highly expensive bills aggressively piled up, and the blinding fear of catastrophic failure violently squeezed her chest. But then, she clearly heard the beautiful, soft, highly rhythmic breathing of her precious daughters securely in their cheap cribs, and she aggressively pulled herself directly back up. Pure, unconditional love miraculously gave her a massive, terrifying strength that pure logic dictated she absolutely shouldn't possess. She fiercely learned exactly how to aggressively stretch every single pathetic dollar, how to graciously accept the rare, pure kindness of complete strangers when it unexpectedly arrived, and exactly how to aggressively, violently fight for her beautiful daughters in highly profound ways that an arrogant man like Ethan would absolutely never, ever comprehend. She absolutely no longer actively thought of him with pathetic longing, only with a highly bitter, cold resentment that slowly, beautifully mutated into absolute, total indifference. He had arrogantly, maliciously chosen his massive, soulless empire completely over them. And by aggressively doing so, he had inadvertently, generously, given her the absolute, ultimate opportunity to flawlessly discover her own massive, unbreakable strength. By the exact time Anna and Grace beautifully turned 2 years old, Catherine had successfully, flawlessly, built a highly fragile, but incredibly real, beautiful world completely around them. It absolutely wasn't elite or highly glamorous, but it was completely, utterly filled to the brim with pure, unadulterated love. They intimately knew the beautiful lullabies softly sung entirely in the dark night, the absolute, pure warmth of her strong arms, and the highly secure, unbreakable constancy of her absolute presence. She had violently lost absolutely everything she genuinely thought she desperately needed, but completely in return, she had miraculously, beautifully found absolutely everything that truly, genuinely mattered. And although she absolutely could not have possibly imagined it right then, highly cruel, massive destiny was already aggressively weaving a terrifying, highly surprising reunion that would violently tear completely open the highly toxic past she had tried so incredibly hard to permanently bury. Catherine survived and raised her twins all alone. What's the hardest challenge you've ever faced and overcome? Share your story below. The cracks in the armor. Ethan Reiner absolutely never, ever permitted himself to actively think about the toxic past. Or at least, that was exactly what he arrogantly told himself every single time a highly unwelcome, agonizing memory desperately attempted to violently surface. His massive global empire aggressively demanded absolute, unadulterated focus. His pristine, highly curated corporate reputation demanded complete, highly calculated composure. And he had meticulously, aggressively built massive, impenetrable walls of highly rigid routine and explosive corporate success completely around himself. Built them so incredibly carefully that absolutely no one entirely within his highly elite circle could ever clearly see the massive, growing cracks. To the massive elite world, he was the absolute perfect man who flawlessly possessed it all. A highly terrifying, untouchable multimillionaire in his early 30s. Impeccably dressed entirely in bespoke, highly tailored Tom Ford suits. Confidently sitting directly at the absolute head of incredibly long, highly polished mahogany tables, where massive, powerful men exactly twice his age hung desperately on his every single whispered word. He was absolutely, terrifyingly ruthless in high-stakes negotiations, completely, utterly impassive when aggressively closing multi-million-dollar deals. Deeply admired for his massive corporate vision, and violently feared for his highly lethal precision. However, absolutely no massive amount of global power or highly public acclaim could completely, successfully silence the highly dark, terrifying shadows that sometimes violently crept into his brilliant mind when the dark nights were agonizingly long, and the heavy silence aggressively pressed way too heavily entirely against the massive glass walls of his luxury penthouse. He had aggressively, violently buried Catherine entirely in the dark part of his memory, highly labeled as pathetic mistakes, arrogantly convincing himself that exactly what he had ruthlessly demanded of her was completely necessary, even highly wise. He toxically told himself that she would be significantly better off entirely without him, that she absolutely could not have possibly survived the massive, crushing weight of his elite, terrifying world, and that aggressively, violently severing ties had been a highly necessary act of pure clarity, rather than an act of pure, unadulterated cruelty. But completely beneath those highly calculated, carefully constructed lies lay the absolute, brutal truth that he completely refused to actively confront. He was absolutely terrified, massively terrified of change, blindly terrified of pure vulnerability, highly terrified of actively allowing pure love to violently knock him completely off the massive pedestal he had aggressively carved entirely in solid stone. He had fiercely chosen his massive empire entirely because it aggressively required absolutely nothing more than pure, unadulterated ambition. And in massive exchange, he had ruthlessly abandoned something he absolutely didn't fully, profoundly understand until it was way too incredibly, agonizingly late. The agonizing years rapidly passed in a massive, highly chaotic blur of elite contracts, global interviews, and explosive corporate expansion. Ethan actively became the highly celebrated, absolute face of massive corporate success, the prime example that elite business schools aggressively cited, the exact man that Forbes magazine highly enthusiastically called the visionary of steel, yet completely. Despite absolutely all the massive accolades, he highly frequently returned entirely to his massive empty house with the highly gnawing, painful emptiness of a man who had aggressively traded way too incredibly much for way too incredibly little. His elite assistants nervously whispered entirely about his highly grueling, long hours, his absolute highly aggressive refusal to ever take vacations, his highly toxic, terrifying obsession with absolute control. But absolutely none of them ever dared to directly question him in person. He flawlessly carried on with the highly practiced, arrogant confidence of a terrifying man who had absolutely never, ever failed. But deep, completely deep down, he agonizingly wondered exactly why his massive, billion-dollar victories absolutely no longer felt like genuine triumphs. The beautiful image of Catherine sometimes violently intruded completely without warning. He clearly, vividly, saw her beautifully laughing in a highly fleeting, agonizing vision. He physically felt her massive absence exactly like a deep, bleeding wound that could absolutely never, ever close. He aggressively ignored it. He rapidly poured himself another expensive drink. He violently buried himself entirely in another massive corporate deal. He absolutely had not read her absolute final text message. He absolutely never admitted it to a single soul. But the highly unread, massive notification was absolutely still actively sitting on his secure phone. A highly silent, terrifying reminder that he absolutely could never, ever bring himself to violently delete. He absolutely never, ever looked. Because deep down, he profoundly knew that exactly what it contained might completely, violently undo him. And he absolutely could not afford to be completely undone. Ethan ignored Catherine's final text message for 2 years. What do you think that message said? Drop your guess below. The collision in the mall. Massive, highly cruel destiny, however, absolutely does not respect the highly rigid, massive walls that arrogant men desperately build completely around themselves. On a completely, seemingly ordinary afternoon, while Ethan was aggressively moving entirely through the highly gleaming, pristine corridors of a luxury shopping mall directly between elite corporate meetings, the toxic past violently, catastrophically, collided completely with him in a highly explosive manner that completely shattered absolutely everything. He vividly saw her absolutely first. Catherine. Her beautiful blonde hair flawlessly, softly falling entirely over her shoulders. Her piercing blue eyes actively scanning the expensive storefronts with the highly calm, absolute concentration of a fierce mother actively keeping her children incredibly close. For one microscopic fraction of a second, he genuinely, arrogantly thought his exhausted mind was violently playing a highly cruel, toxic trick on him. A highly cruel, hallucinated illusion aggressively conjured entirely by toxic guilt. But then, he vividly saw them, exactly 2 tiny, absolutely beautiful little girls, completely, utterly identical in every single, flawless feature, with highly shiny dark hair that beautifully caught the bright mall lights, and massive eyes the exact same, precise, dark brown shade as his very own. They were fiercely holding on to Catherine's soft hands as they enthusiastically, happily dragged her directly toward a massive, highly colorful toy store, their tiny, beautiful voices carrying the pure, unadulterated laughter of complete innocence. Ethan completely, violently, stopped dead in his tracks, his massive body entirely frozen, his heavy breath trapped highly painfully directly in his chest. The entire, massive world completely around him went violently blurry. The loud, chaotic chatter of the massive crowd completely faded away until there was absolutely nothing else but the highly terrifying sight of those exactly too many girls. His long legs violently refused to move a single inch. His massive, multi-billion-dollar empire, his endless, immense wealth, his highly curated, terrifyingly strong persona. Absolutely none of it meant a single damn thing in that highly explosive instant. Because he profoundly knew, with absolute, terrifying, 100% certainty, exactly what he was intensely looking at. They were his biological daughters. Catherine slowly turned her head right then. Her beautiful eyes violently met his. In her piercing gaze, he saw absolutely zero pure warmth. Zero pathetic longing. Only a massive, highly impenetrable wall of pure, absolute steel. Exactly as impenetrable as the highly toxic one he had once violently used entirely against her. She aggressively pulled the tiny girl significantly closer, her soft hand actively gripping theirs with a highly fierce, absolute protective force. Ethan desperately wanted to violently scream, to aggressively close the massive distance, to actively say something, absolutely anything. But his dry throat completely constricted, and absolutely no sound managed to escape. He had successfully, flawlessly, faced down highly hostile, massive corporate boards of directors. He had aggressively negotiated with highly lethal men who would violently ruin him without blinking a single eye. And he had absolutely never, ever wavered. Yet, right here, in the absolute dead center of a public mall, violently confronted with the absolute truth he had entirely refused to face. He was completely, utterly paralyzed. One of the tiny girls slowly looked directly at him, exactly as she happily skipped past. Her massive, beautiful brown eyes fiercely held his for exactly one microscopic fraction of a second. That highly innocent look violently pierced him significantly deeper than absolutely any toxic accusation ever could have. Because in her highly innocent, pure curiosity, he vividly, horrifyingly, saw not only an absolute reflection of himself, but also absolutely everything he had violently, permanently missed. The absolute first time they had beautifully opened their eyes, their incredibly tiny first steps, their absolute, very first words. His massive chest violently ached with a highly toxic guilt so incredibly sharp that he genuinely thought he might completely, physically, collapse. Catherine aggressively turned completely away, firmly guiding them completely out of sight. And exactly just like that, the massive, explosive moment was permanently gone. But Ethan absolutely remained standing there, his massive heart violently pounding. The massive, horrifying realization aggressively crashing completely down onto him. The exact, beautiful lives he had ruthlessly demanded be violently erased, had absolutely not only miraculously survived, but they had beautifully, fiercely thrived completely without him. That exact night, entirely alone in his massive luxury penthouse, Ethan aggressively poured himself an expensive drink. But he completely left it untouched. He sat heavily in absolute, dead silence, intensely staring directly at the highly unread, massive message entirely on his secure phone. The exact one he had arrogantly, violently ignored agonizing years ago. He profoundly knew exactly what it explicitly contained now, even completely without opening it. He absolutely had not just violently walked completely away entirely from Catherine. He had aggressively walked entirely away from them. Exactly two beautiful lives. Exactly two identical daughters. Both actively possessing his exact eyes. Both absolute, total strangers to him. And for the absolute first time in his entire, highly calculated life. The terrifying, untouchable billionaire who had absolutely never, ever known pure fear, felt completely, utterly, devastatingly powerless. He profoundly realized that absolutely all of his massive victories, all of his highly endless wealth, all of his meticulously protected, toxic pride, it absolutely meant nothing. Exactly nothing in the absolute face of exactly what he had violently, permanently lost. The agony of regret. Ethan barely slept a single wink completely after that explosive encounter entirely in the shopping mall. He lay completely awake during the agonizingly long, dark hours of the freezing night, violently reliving every single microscopic detail with a massive intensity that felt exactly like a highly brutal punishment. The vivid sight of Catherine's soft hand, firmly, fiercely intertwined completely with those of the two tiny girls, remained violently burned entirely into his mind, exactly like a highly permanent photograph. He vividly remembered the precise curve of their beautiful cheeks, the exact way their dark hair beautifully caught the bright light, and absolutely, mostly, their beautiful eyes. The exact same, precise, dark brown shade as his highly own. He absolutely could not escape the massive, horrifying realization that he had ruthlessly, violently denied them even completely before their highly fragile birth. And yet, here they miraculously were, beautifully alive and highly vibrant, happily walking directly alongside their fierce mother, exactly as if the entire massive world absolutely never, ever needed him. The massive, crushing weight of exactly what he had violently lost oppressed him so incredibly heavily that he could literally barely breathe. In the highly chaotic days that violently followed, Ethan aggressively functioned entirely on automatic pilot. He confidently went to massive meetings. He flawlessly delivered elite speeches. He aggressively signed massive, multi-million-dollar contracts for significantly more money than the vast majority of men would ever see in their entire lives. But absolutely everything felt incredibly, utterly empty. His elite executives constantly, aggressively praised him for his highly sharp acuity, his massive ability to flawlessly see highly lucrative opportunities that absolutely everyone else completely missed. But Ethan profoundly knew his brilliant mind was entirely elsewhere. Every single time he heavily closed his eyes, he vividly saw those two tiny girls. Every single time he clearly heard loud laughter, beautifully echoing completely down the pristine corridors of his massive office. He violently imagined their beautiful voices entirely in its place. His meticulously, aggressively constructed massive empire had absolutely never, ever felt so incredibly, pathetically insignificant. He had absolutely always arrogantly believed that massive wealth could flawlessly insulate him entirely from pathetic regret, that explosive achievements could magically drown out the highly terrifying ghosts that might violently haunt him. Now, he profoundly knew he had been completely, catastrophically wrong. Massive money could easily buy him absolutely anything, except the agonizing, beautiful years he had already permanently, violently lost. He aggressively began to desperately search entirely for them, in highly small, almost pathetic ways. At absolute first, he frantically returned directly to the exact same shopping mall, under the highly fake guise of running errands, aggressively scanning the massive crowds with the highly desperate hope that he might miraculously catch a highly fleeting glimpse of them again. When that catastrophically failed, he aggressively called in highly massive favors. He asked highly discreet, probing questions entirely through elite, discreet contacts, aggressively utilizing the massive, terrifying network that had absolutely always flawlessly ensured he remained completely ahead of his massive rivals. It absolutely did not take Hailey long. In a matter of mere days, he aggressively had a massive, thick envelope sitting directly on his mahogany desk, completely filled with highly detailed photographs and massive notes. Every single, tiny detail of their entire lives meticulously compiled completely into neat lines of highly typed text. Catherine lived peacefully in a highly modest, incredibly quiet neighborhood, completely far away from the gleaming, massive skyscrapers that Ethan arrogantly called home. She carefully drove a highly battered old car, one that actually seemed way too incredibly small to safely, comfortably carry 2 growing children. And she brutally worked a highly exhausting part-time job completely at a local store. The identical twins, Anna and Grace, happily attended a highly modest nearby daycare. The highly detailed report explicitly described them as incredibly healthy, completely happy, and entirely full of pure energy. And every single beautiful photo was the absolute, undeniable proof of it. Ethan sat completely frozen, entirely in his massive office, long after the towering building had completely emptied out, intensely staring at beautiful images of his biological daughters, happily running completely across a tiny playground, enthusiastically playing with cheap toys, fiercely clinging entirely to their beautiful mother, with absolute, unbreakable, unadulterated trust. The vivid sight of Catherine violently hit him the absolute hardest. She absolutely no longer looked exactly like the highly polished woman he vividly remembered, completely dressed in incredibly expensive designer clothes and sitting directly across from him at luxury, massive dinners. Instead, she flawlessly wore highly simple, cheap clothes. Her beautiful blonde hair was frequently pulled completely up, her highly exhausted face clearly marked with deep, heavy lines of pure exhaustion that spoke entirely of sleepless nights and massive, constant worry. Yet, there was a massive, unbreakable strength in her beautiful eyes that he had absolutely never, ever noticed before. Or perhaps, one that he had violently, ruthlessly destroyed, and she had miraculously, fiercely rebuilt completely without him. She had fiercely, beautifully raised exactly 2 children completely alone, completely without his massive money, without his highly powerful support, without even his pathetic acknowledgement. That massive realization utterly, completely shattered him. Despite absolutely all of his massive, terrifying power, despite absolutely all the elite boardrooms he aggressively commanded, it was Catherine who had miraculously, undeniably proven to be infinitely stronger than he had ever been. Ethan spent agonizing nights intensely staring at those beautiful photos. Toxic guilt violently tearing him completely apart with every single page. He vividly remembered the highly freezing, cruel way he had ruthlessly dismissed her. The absolute, unadulterated cruelty of his strict order. The highly toxic arrogance that had aggressively convinced him he was completely above the highly massive responsibilities of true fatherhood. He had violently silenced her, maliciously ignored her, and ruthlessly walked completely away. And in aggressively doing so, he had absolutely not just abandoned her, he had violently abandoned them. Now, intensely looking at every single beautiful image of Anna and Grace, he vividly, horrifyingly saw exactly how incredibly much he had violently missed. Their absolute first, pure smiles, their very first words, their tiny first steps. Absolutely all of it was completely, permanently gone. Beautiful moments that he could absolutely never, ever recover. He absolutely hadn't just simply missed them. He had violently aggressively thrown them completely into the garbage long before they even had the tiny chance to ever exist. Finally, he literally could no longer bear the massive, suffocating distance. One dark, freezing night, he aggressively drove directly to the quiet neighborhood, exactly where they peacefully lived. Highly strategically parking his massive, expensive car exactly several houses entirely down to actively avoid drawing any highly suspicious attention. From the dark shadows, he intensely watched as Catherine, exhausted, carried heavy groceries directly into the small house. The identical twins happily skipping completely around her, their pure, loud laughter beautifully echoing completely down the quiet street. The highly innocent sound violently pierced him significantly deeper than absolutely any highly toxic criticism he had absolutely ever received. He aggressively gripped the heavy steering wheel so incredibly tight that his knuckles turned pure, bone white. Every single, microscopic part of him violently screamed to aggressively step out, to loudly, desperately call entirely to her, to violently drop directly to his knees right in front of those beautiful girls and explicitly tell them the absolute brutal truth. Yet, highly toxic fear aggressively kept him securely pinned entirely in his place. The exact same, highly pathetic fear that had once aggressively caused him to cruelly demand the highly unthinkable was now actively, violently holding him entirely back from the absolute only thing he desperately, fiercely desired the absolute most. He stayed entirely there until the warm lights of the small house completely clicked off and the entire neighborhood went completely, utterly silent. His shattered heart violently ached entirely with every single agonizing moment he cowardly postponed. Every single, precious second that violently slipped entirely through his fingers. But as he slowly drove completely back to the massive city, the beautiful faces of Anna and Grace violently haunted him, absolutely refusing to ever fade. He profoundly realized then that he absolutely could no longer cowardly hide completely behind pathetic excuses or highly toxic pride. The massive, multi-billion-dollar empire he had aggressively built suddenly felt incredibly fragile, entirely in comparison to the massive, beautiful bond he had violently denied himself. Catherine's fierce, unbreakable strength had miraculously created a beautiful life completely without him. But he would absolutely no longer remain a terrifying stranger. He absolutely could not magically undo the toxic past. But he could aggressively, violently, fight for a massive place entirely in their beautiful future. And as he smoothly pulled entirely into the highly empty, massive garage of his luxury penthouse, Ethan whispered the beautiful names he had learned entirely from that highly confidential report. Anna, Grace. Exactly as if clearly saying them entirely out loud could magically anchor him completely to the massive promise violently forming entirely in his shattered heart. He would absolutely never, ever run away again. This time, he would aggressively face the massive, terrifying storm he had violently created. No matter exactly how incredibly much it violently destroyed him completely in the process. Ethan finally goes to confront Catherine. How do you think she will react when he shows up at her door? Drop your guesses below. The first contact, when Ethan finally, desperately mustered the massive, terrifying courage to actively approach Catherine, it was absolutely not the highly imposing, grand entrance of a terrifying man who had aggressively spent his entire life being blindly obeyed. He absolutely did not confidently arrive with a massive, elite entourage or a highly expensive, flashy gift maliciously intended to illegally buy pathetic forgiveness. He came completely, utterly alone. standing highly awkwardly, entirely on the worn, wooden front steps of her modest house. His bespoke, light brown tailored suit, looking incredibly, pathetically out of place entirely in the quiet, working-class neighborhood. For the absolute first time in his entire adult life, his massive hands were violently trembling. He knocked on the heavy door incredibly softly, almost desperately expecting her to absolutely not answer, almost frantically praying that she actually would. And when the heavy door finally, slowly opened, vividly seeing her violently hit him significantly harder than absolutely any brutal, physical blow he had absolutely ever received. Catherine stood firmly entirely in the doorway. Her beautiful hair was casually pulled completely up. Her piercing blue eyes were incredibly sharp, but highly cautious. Her slender body slightly, aggressively angled entirely in front of the exactly two tiny girls, who were curiously peeking entirely out from completely behind her legs. Anna was tightly holding a cheap plastic doll. Grace was fiercely clinging entirely to Catherine's simple dress, and their massive, beautiful brown eyes firmly locked entirely onto him with a pure, unadulterated, innocent curiosity for one massive, agonizing moment. Absolutely all words completely abandoned him. He had meticulously rehearsed exactly a dozen highly polished speeches entirely in his brilliant mind. Highly practiced, fake apologies that sounded almost incredibly noble. But standing directly, completely in front of them, he profoundly realized exactly how incredibly, pathetically hollow those words truly were. The heavy silence violently stretched agonizingly long until Catherine finally spoke. Her beautiful voice was incredibly firm and forged entirely of pure steel. "What exactly do you want, Ethan?" It absolutely wasn't a pathetic question completely filled with tragic longing. It was a highly sharp question that aggressively carried the massive, crushing weight of agonizing years of brutal betrayal. He swallowed incredibly hard, physically feeling his dry throat completely, violently tighten. I desperately needed to see you, to explicitly see them." He looked deeply at the identical twins. His massive heart violently ached entirely as they highly cautiously shrank closer entirely to their fierce mother, absolutely not knowing who the hell he was. Catherine's sharp jaw violently clenched, her piercing eyes aggressively narrowed. "You already vividly saw us exactly once, at the crowded mall. You absolutely didn't need to aggressively come here." Her voice was highly cutting, incredibly defensive, but completely underneath it, he genuinely thought he clearly heard the highly faint, fragile tremble of incredibly old, massive wounds. He slowly shook his head, aggressively forcing himself to fiercely meet her piercing gaze. "No, that was absolutely not enough. I absolutely cannot fully explain exactly what it did to me. Seeing them, profoundly realizing exactly what I violently missed, exactly what I maliciously, arrogantly threw into the garbage. I am absolutely not here to give you pathetic excuses, Catherine. I just desperately want exactly one single chance to slowly get to know them. To be absolutely something more than just a terrifying stranger they will absolutely never, ever remember." Her beautiful eyes violently flashed with pure, blinding anger. She aggressively stepped completely into the doorway now, flawlessly, fiercely blocking the absolute entire view of the tiny girls. "You absolutely do not get to arrogantly decide that right now. Absolutely not after everything. Do you even vividly remember exactly what the hell you cruelly said to me? Do you clearly remember arrogantly demanding that I violently end their beautiful lives? Exactly as if they were nothing more than a pathetic, corporate inconvenience?" Every single heavy word violently struck him exactly like a lethal leather whip. He heavily bowed his head. Massive, crushing shame aggressively coursing completely through his entire body. "I vividly remember," he admitted. His deep voice was incredibly raw, "and it is the absolute greatest, most catastrophic regret of my entire life. I absolutely cannot magically undo it. I absolutely cannot erase the pure cruelty of that horrific night. But I can aggressively try to spend the absolute rest of my entire life making 100% sure they profoundly know they are fiercely wanted, that they are deeply loved. I can aggressively try to be the true father I absolutely should have been from the very beginning." The heavy air entirely between them became incredibly, terrifyingly dense. Catherine's soft hands violently trembled slightly, but her beautiful voice remained absolutely, flawlessly steady. "Do you honestly, arrogantly, think that simply magically appearing right now instantly erases exactly 2 agonizing years of complete, toxic silence? You absolutely were not there when they were violently sick, when they violently woke up screaming entirely in the night, when I desperately had to agonizingly choose entirely between paying the cheap rent or actively buying their vital medication. You absolutely were not there when they happily took their very first steps, when they cried out entirely for someone to fiercely hold them. I was, completely alone. You absolutely cannot simply arrogantly waltz in here and aggressively rewrite history purely because your highly toxic conscience suddenly, finally caught up with you." Ethan physically felt exactly as if her heavy words were violently tearing him entirely apart. Every single one, an absolute, brutal reminder of absolutely everything he had violently lost, and absolutely everything he had tragically failed to be. He desperately wanted to aggressively argue, to firmly tell her that right now could absolutely be different. But he profoundly realized that there was absolutely nothing he could possibly say to magically erase her massive, agonizing pain. Instead, he slowly nodded. His deep voice was incredibly quiet, but entirely unshakable. "You are 100% right. I absolutely wasn't there, and I will absolutely never ever forgive myself entirely for it. I am absolutely not asking you to pathetically forgive me either. I am simply desperately begging you to let me aggressively try. Absolutely not for me. Entirely for them." There was an incredibly long, heavy silence, completely broken, absolutely only by the highly faint, sweet sound of the tiny girls softly whispering completely to each other, entirely behind their mother's legs. Finally, Catherine slowly turned slightly. Her beautiful eyes rapidly flickered directly toward them completely, before fiercely returning directly to his. "If you are entirely, genuinely serious about doing this, you aggressively start incredibly small. You absolutely cannot simply burst in and arrogantly play the massive hero. You will fiercely earn every single second of their pure trust, and the absolute first time you violently break it, you will absolutely never, ever see them again." Her beautiful voice slightly trembled entirely on the absolute last word, but her massive determination was completely, utterly clear. Ethan's chest violently tightened, but he aggressively nodded highly rapidly, almost completely desperately. "I will happily accept absolutely whatever you generously give me. I will consistently show up. I will permanently stay. I will violently fight for them. I absolutely do not care exactly how incredibly long it takes." Catherine intensely studied him for exactly 1 moment, significantly longer. Exactly as if she were aggressively searching entirely for the massive, toxic arrogance that had once completely defined him. When she absolutely found completely none of it, she slowly, gracefully, stepped completely aside, exactly just enough so he could vividly see the identical twins significantly more clearly. Anna's massive eyes went completely wide, exactly as she whispered softly to her identical sister. "Who exactly is he?" Grace's tiny forehead deeply furrowed entirely with pure curiosity, her tiny hand absolutely still fiercely clinging directly to Catherine's simple dress. Ethan's massive heart violently clenched exactly as he whispered incredibly softly. "I am simply someone who desperately wants to profoundly know you, if you will graciously let me." Catherine absolutely did not explicitly respond, but she also absolutely did not violently close the heavy door. And for Ethan, that highly small, simple act physically felt exactly like the absolute, very first crack of blinding light, aggressively breaking completely through agonizing years of absolute, terrifying darkness. As he stood perfectly there, intensely looking directly at his beautiful daughters for the absolute first time, completely without a massive crowd or a massive distance entirely between them, he profoundly realized that this was absolutely not a highly calculated corporate negotiation that he could effortlessly win entirely with highly toxic charm or massive power. This was the absolute, brutal fight of his entire life. And the absolute, only clear path entirely forward was entirely, with pure humility, unbreakable patience, and a massive, profound love that he had once been way too incredibly terrified to fully give. Catherine is giving Ethan a tiny chance. Do you think he will ruin it or prove he has changed? Share your thoughts below. Earning trust in the park, Ethan aggressively returned the exact following week, completely unsure if Catherine would genuinely, truly allow him to enter. And every single step directly toward her front door physically felt exactly like confidently walking directly into a massive, terrifying federal trial that he was completely unprepared for. He had flawlessly closed multi-billion-dollar massive mergers completely without breaking a single sweat. Yet, the terrifying idea of being violently rejected by her, by them, pressed agonizingly tightly entirely against his massive chest. When the heavy door finally, slowly opened, Catherine was standing perfectly there again, her beautiful expression highly cautious. But this time, she absolutely did not instantly, aggressively shut him out. She allowed him to stand highly awkwardly entirely on the small porch until Anna and Grace confidently appeared directly behind her, their tiny hands fiercely clinging entirely to her simple dress as they stared intensely at him with a highly complex mixture of pure curiosity and extreme caution. Catherine finally spoke. Her beautiful voice was highly cutting, but incredibly firm. "We are actively going directly to the local park. You can absolutely come, but you strictly stay entirely in the background. Absolutely zero intrusive questions. Absolutely zero toxic pressure." Ethan eagerly accepted almost instantly, almost way too incredibly fast, and he highly respectfully followed them entirely at a safe distance, exactly as they walked completely down the quiet suburban street. The identical twins happily skipped entirely ahead, laughing loudly and enthusiastically, pointing at every single dog that excitedly passed by, or every single autumn leaf that beautifully fluttered down. Their pure, unadulterated energy was so incredibly boundless that he actually found himself deeply marveling at the exact, flawless way Catherine effortlessly kept their rapid pace. She looked incredibly tired. Yes, but also highly serene, powerful in a massive way that he had absolutely never, ever noticed before. He horrifyingly realized with a highly sharp, piercing sting of pain that she had miraculously become absolutely everything he had once arrogantly thought she absolutely couldn't be. Not entirely because of him, but completely in spite of him. At the colorful park, the tiny girls enthusiastically ran directly toward the massive swings, loudly calling for their beautiful mother to actively push them significantly higher. Ethan stood completely frozen, exactly at the absolute edge of the noisy playground, physically feeling exactly like a massive, highly toxic intruder entirely in a beautiful life that should have absolutely always been entirely his to beautifully share. He violently hesitated, until Anna slowly looked completely over her tiny shoulder, her massive eyes directly meeting his. She slightly tilted her tiny head, and after a highly pregnant pause, she softly called entirely out to him. "Do you actively want to push too?" It was an incredibly simple, beautiful invitation, spoken entirely with the highly innocent, pure directness of a tiny child who absolutely did not completely understand the massive, emotional gravity of her simple words. Ethan physically felt his dry throat violently tighten exactly as he stepped completely forward, his massive hands violently trembling entirely as he incredibly carefully, gently pushed the heavy swing, absolutely terrified of making a catastrophic mistake, absolutely terrified of violently breaking the incredibly fragile, tiny trust that was being miraculously offered entirely to him. Anna laughed loudly, an incredibly bright, beautiful sound that violently pierced completely straight through the impenetrable armor he had aggressively worn for agonizing years. And Grace rapidly, aggressively, demanded her equal turn. In a matter of mere minutes, he was actively pushing them absolutely both, his massive heart violently swelling entirely with every single scream of pure joy, his brilliant mind aggressively racing with the horrifying realization of exactly how incredibly much he had already permanently, violently lost. Catherine intensely watched completely from a nearby wooden bench, her posture highly rigid, her piercing eyes incredibly sharp, exactly as if actively daring him to violently falter. But as she intensely watched her beautiful daughter laugh hysterically completely under his incredibly careful, gentle hands, she vividly saw something massive she absolutely did not expect. A highly profound, deep tenderness entirely in his handsome expression that had absolutely never, ever existed completely before. It absolutely wasn't the freezing, highly inflexible, arrogant man she had violently left completely behind. He looked incredibly awkward, highly uncertain, almost completely fragile, but also entirely, utterly present, in a massive way that completely, utterly surprised her. She absolutely did not lower her heavy guard, but for the absolute first time in agonizing years, she deeply wondered if perhaps there was actually something significantly more to his massive regret than just empty, pathetic words. Significantly later, they sat peacefully together, completely on the soft grass, for a tiny, simple picnic that Catherine had meticulously prepared. Ethan was agonizingly, highly aware of exactly how incredibly out of place he actively looked, sitting awkwardly cross-legged entirely on the dirty ground in his highly expensive, bespoke clothes. But he aggressively forced himself to remain completely still, to intently listen exactly as the tiny girls happily babbled entirely about their favorite, colorful games and the beautiful stories they fiercely loved completely before bedtime. Hipabansoi aggressively clung entirely to every single word, meticulously engraving every single microscopic detail entirely into his brilliant memory, exactly as if it were a massive, priceless treasure. When Grace happily leaned heavily directly against him completely without realizing it, highly distracted entirely by a sweet cookie securely in her tiny hand, Ethan physically felt his entire massive body completely freeze. It was the absolute, very first time that exactly one of them had physically touched him completely without hesitation. And the massive crushing weight of it almost completely, violently undid him. He absolutely did not dare to move a single muscle, absolutely terrified that she would violently pull entirely away. But when she peacefully stayed right there, incredibly comfortable and entirely without any worries, something massive entirely inside him violently broke, completely wide open. As the late afternoon slowly, beautifully faded, Catherine efficiently gathered the tiny girls and confidently stood up to safely leave. Ethan also stood up, completely unsure if he should actively follow them, absolutely terrified of aggressively overstepping his fragile boundaries. But Catherine completely, utterly surprised him by speaking incredibly softly, almost highly reluctantly. "Can you safely walk us completely home?" The simple words were incredibly plain. But for Ethan, they held significantly more massive meaning than absolutely any multi-billion-dollar contract he had ever signed. He walked silently directly alongside them, completely in silence, intensely watching exactly how the tiny girls happily skipped completely ahead, their pure laughter beautifully echoing completely down the quiet street. Catherine stayed incredibly close, her imposing presence a highly constant reminder that he was absolutely still actively on probation, absolutely still, completely unproven. Yet, there was a highly faint glimmer of something completely new entirely in her piercing gaze that absolutely hadn't been there before. Not absolute forgiveness, not pure trust, but perhaps the absolute faintest glimmer of pure possibility. That exact night, entirely alone in his massive penthouse, Ethan violently relived every single microscopic moment of the entire day. He thought deeply about the exact way Anna had happily looked completely back, about the beautiful sound of Grace's pure laughter entirely as he pushed her significantly higher, about the heavy, warm weight of her tiny body comfortably leaning entirely against him. He thought intensely about Catherine's sharp, piercing eyes, her firm, unbreakable voice, and the massive walls she absolutely still held highly firmly, entirely in place. He profoundly knew that this was absolutely only the tiny beginning, that he had agonizing years of massive, highly toxic damage to violently undo, and deep, bleeding scars to desperately heal. But for the absolute first time in his entire life, he profoundly felt that he had finally, miraculously, found something massive that was truly, genuinely worth violently fighting for, completely, with absolutely everything he possessed. Absolutely not another toxic empire, not another billion-dollar victory, but the incredibly fragile, beautiful chance to finally be the true father he absolutely should have been from the very beginning. The walls come down. The chaotic weeks slowly, beautifully turned into warm months. And little by little, Ethan miraculously became an incredibly steady, constant presence entirely in the beautiful lives of his daughters. Absolutely no longer just a terrifying stranger standing awkwardly at the front door, but a highly familiar figure they actively began to eagerly expect. Someone who consistently appeared directly at the local park or completely outside the busy daycare with an absolute, unbreakable patience that even completely, utterly surprised himself. He actively learned to violently cast aside his highly boring, massive corporate meetings, aggressively reorganizing the elite, highly strict calendars that his elite assistants had once fiercely guarded entirely with iron precision. All entirely, so he could be absolutely there when Anna and Grace happily waved their colorful drawings entirely in the air, or loudly called entirely out his exact name with their bright, beautiful voices. At absolute first, they absolutely still formally called him Sir Ethan, flawlessly echoing the exact, highly formal way Catherine had initially introduced him. But one quiet night, Anna accidentally slipped and happily called him Dad completely without realizing it. The heavy, beautiful word violently struck him significantly harder than absolutely any elite praise or massive corporate award he had ever received. He fiercely carried that massive, beautiful moment completely with him, exactly like a highly secret, hidden treasure, silently repeating it entirely to himself when the dark nights grew incredibly long and highly lonely. Exactly as if the beautiful word itself possessed the massive, magical power to successfully keep him entirely alive. The massive, highly noticeable change in him absolutely did not go unnoticed. His elite colleagues nervously whispered entirely about exactly how the previously unshakable, terrifying billionaire now highly frequently left massive meetings incredibly early. Exactly how his razor-sharp edge had beautifully softened into something significantly more profoundly human. Exactly how his intense focus seemed significantly less entirely on massive profit margins and infinitely more on actual, real people. He literally did not care a single bit. For the absolute first time in his entire life, he profoundly understood that massive success, entirely measured in cold numbers, meant absolutely nothing. Entirely, in comparison to the pure joy of being eagerly asked to sit heavily on a soft rug and happily help actively build a massive castle entirely with plastic blocks. Grace fiercely loved to eagerly hand him tiny pieces, entirely just to happily watch him fumble, highly awkwardly completely with them, laughing hysterically when his tall tower violently collapsed, and loudly cheering when he enthusiastically tried again. Anna, significantly quieter, but equally highly stubborn, highly frequently curled up completely at his massive side with a heavy book, aggressively insisting that he happily read, even when he awkwardly stumbled over highly simple children's stories that he had absolutely never, ever learned entirely as a child. Every single, beautiful moment felt exactly like a profound lesson. Every single laugh, a massive, priceless gift. Every single touch, a highly agonizing reminder of exactly how incredibly much he had violently thrown completely into the garbage. Catherine remained incredibly cautious, her piercing eyes absolutely always highly vigilant, her absolute trust securely locked entirely behind massive walls she had aggressively built to fiercely protect herself and her beautiful daughters. Ethan absolutely never, ever blamed her entirely for it. He profoundly understood that he had violently destroyed something massive that absolutely could not be magically rebuilt entirely with a few kind, pathetic gestures or a handful of empty promises. He happily accepted her strict rules entirely without a single argument, confidently arriving exactly when she explicitly permitted it, quickly leaving exactly when she firmly requested it, absolutely never aggressively pushing significantly further than she actively allowed. Yet, little by little, her highly rigid posture slowly, beautifully softened. Almost entirely imperceptibly, she absolutely no longer stood completely with her arms tightly crossed entirely at the playground. She absolutely no longer coldly dismissed him entirely with highly dry words, exactly when he lingered a tiny bit too incredibly long at the front door. Sometimes, late at night, when the tiny girls had peacefully fallen asleep, they sat entirely in absolute silence, exactly at her small kitchen table. absolutely not exactly like passionate lovers, desperately rekindling exactly what was violently lost, but exactly like two highly exhausted parents, profoundly connected entirely by the beautiful bond of the children they had miraculously brought entirely into the world. It was entirely during one of those quiet, peaceful evenings that Catherine finally, clearly uttered heavy words that violently cut significantly deeper than absolutely any of her previous white-hot anger. "Do you possess absolutely any idea?" she stated incredibly softly, intensely looking entirely at her soft hands. Entirely, instead of directly at him, exactly what it truly felt like to heavily carry them entirely alone. To clearly, beautifully hear their tiny hearts actively beating completely inside me, entirely, while you were aggressively building massive towers of cold glass and hard steel. To sit terrified on a cold hospital bed, heavily holding two fragile newborns, and profoundly know that the exact man who absolutely should have been right there had violently, ruthlessly turned his broad back completely on us. Her beautiful voice violently trembled, and Ethan's massive chest violently tightened entirely, with a highly toxic guilt so incredibly sharp that he could literally barely breathe. He frantically searched for adequate words, but absolutely none came. Only the absolute, brutal truth that absolutely no pathetic excuse could ever possibly justify the horrific choices he had aggressively made. Absolutely all he could softly whisper was, "I was an absolute, pathetic coward. I arrogantly thought that absolute strength meant violently shutting you completely out. I profoundly see now that it was absolute, pathetic weakness. And if it actively takes me the absolute rest of my entire life to fiercely prove it entirely to you, entirely to them, then that is exactly what I will flawlessly do." Catherine absolutely did not explicitly respond, but her heavy silence was absolutely not the exact same as a violent rejection. She intensely studied him for a highly long, agonizing time, and even though her beautiful face absolutely revealed nothing, Ethan genuinely believed he clearly saw the absolute faintest glimmer of something entirely changing completely in her eyes. Absolutely not pure forgiveness. Not yet. But perhaps the massive, profound recognition that he was absolutely no longer the exact same toxic man who had once violently destroyed her. Ethan is stepping up and making an effort. But do you think Catherine should fully let him back into her life? Why or why not? Let us know. The rain and the realization. The absolute massive turning point violently arrived on a highly rainy afternoon, exactly when Grace accidentally tripped and violently scraped her tiny knee entirely on the wet playground. Her tiny, highly piercing cry caused Ethan to violently sprint completely before he even actively realized he had miraculously moved. He violently dropped directly to his knees right in the freezing mud, aggressively scooping her completely up entirely, with massive hands that were violently trembling, entirely from something significantly more than just simple worry. He urgently whispered highly soothing words, gently cradling her, exactly as if she were flawlessly made of highly fragile, expensive crystal. When Catherine frantically arrived exactly mere seconds later, she completely stopped dead entirely in her tracks, vividly seeing him fiercely hold his biological daughter, with so incredibly much raw, blinding fear entirely in his eyes. So incredibly much highly desperate, pure tenderness entirely in his deep voice. It was completely, utterly different from absolutely anything she had ever seen entirely in him before. In that exact, highly emotional moment, something massive completely inside her violently cracked. A heavy, thick piece of the massive armor she had aggressively worn for agonizing years violently splintered entirely against her absolute will. She smoothly kneeled directly beside him, their soft hands gently brushing entirely together, exactly as they lovingly comforted the crying girl completely together. And for the absolute first time in agonizing years, she absolutely did not violently pull away. That exact night, exactly as he was slowly leaving her small house, Catherine quietly accompanied him completely to the front door. He stood perfectly there for a highly long, heavy moment, the beautiful, soft sound of the gentle rain falling beautifully on the roof. Completely before she finally spoke. "You are absolutely not completely forgiven, but you are absolutely here, and perhaps that is exactly enough for right now." Ethan nodded fiercely, his dry throat completely tight, his piercing eyes violently stinging entirely with a massive, pure emotion that he actively refused to cowardly hide. He profoundly understood that this was absolutely not the massive victory, not absolute redemption, but it was something massive that he had absolutely never, ever dared to genuinely hope for. A highly fragile, beautiful chance to finally, truly belong. As he drove smoothly entirely back to the massive city, the glittering lights of his multi-billion-dollar empire brilliantly shining entirely in the distance, Ethan profoundly realized that he absolutely no longer cared entirely about their arrogant shine. For the absolute first time in his entire life, he profoundly felt that the absolute, true center of his massive world absolutely wasn't completely in elite boardrooms or highly sensational headlines, but entirely in the pure laughter of exactly two tiny girls, and in the highly cautious, beautifully unspoken hope entirely in their mother's eyes. He had aggressively spent agonizing years meticulously building massive, impenetrable walls. But now, for the absolute first time, he was actively, eagerly learning exactly how to violently tear them completely down, brick by broken brick. Absolutely all entirely for the beautiful family that he had once been way too incredibly, arrogantly blind to genuinely embrace. The new beginning, the warm spring beautifully arrived with a highly quiet, pure sense of massive renewal, and entirely with it came beautiful, massive changes that Catherine could absolutely no longer stubbornly ignore. The tiny girls were significantly older now, highly curious, and completely filled with pure, boundless energy. Their loud, pure laughter completely filled every single corner of the small house, and Ethan was absolutely no longer just a terrifying shadow standing highly awkwardly, entirely at the absolute edge of their beautiful lives. He was absolutely there in the bright mornings exactly when he could, happily bringing delicious breakfast pastries that the tiny girls enthusiastically devoured completely before school. And he was absolutely there, entirely in the late afternoons, happily kneeling directly on the floor, entirely in his expensive shirt sleeves, exactly as Anna and Grace aggressively insisted that he happily play exactly one more round of their absolute favorite board game. He had miraculously, flawlessly become an absolute, integral part of their beautiful rhythm. Absolutely not entirely without problems. Absolutely not flawlessly, perfectly, but completely with an absolute, unbreakable persistence that had violently splintered her massive walls, until she profoundly realized that she had completely stopped actively waiting for him to violently disappear. He had permanently stayed, through the freezing rain and the bitter cold, through the highly agonizing moments of deep mistrust, and the dark nights when she actively closed the heavy door completely in his face. He fiercely stayed because, for the absolute first time in his entire life, he desperately wanted absolutely nothing more than to genuinely belong completely to something that he absolutely could not simply buy. One quiet night, Catherine stood perfectly in the doorway of the cozy living room, intensely watching him exactly as he sat happily cross-legged, entirely on the soft rug. Both tiny girls, comfortably leaning heavily, entirely against him, their tiny heads peacefully resting directly against his broad chest. He was happily telling them a highly complex, magical story, stumbling awkwardly over the difficult words, but flawlessly making them laugh hysterically anyway. His deep voice incredibly soft, entirely in a way she had absolutely never, ever heard completely before. The beautiful sight took her completely by massive surprise, violently stealing her very breath. Because for one highly fleeting magical moment, she absolutely did not see the terrifying, ruthless man who had once violently broken her. She clearly saw a beautiful, loving father who had miraculously learned to fiercely love entirely through the exact same children he had once ruthlessly rejected. When Anna's eyes peacefully fluttered closed, and Grace yawned heavily entirely against his shoulder, Ethan slowly looked up directly at Catherine, and in his piercing gaze, there was absolutely zero toxic arrogance, zero highly entitled demand, just a highly silent, desperate plea for pure, absolute acceptance. Significantly later that exact night, long after the tiny girls had peacefully fallen fast asleep, they sat quietly together, exactly at the small kitchen table. Catherine nervously prepared hot tea, her soft hands violently trembling slightly, exactly as she gently placed the warm cup directly in front of him. The heavy silence violently stretched entirely between them, completely filled entirely with agonizing years of highly unspoken, massive pain. Until she finally, bravely broke it. Do you absolutely ever actively think entirely about exactly what you would have been entirely like if you had simply, bravely stayed? Her beautiful voice was incredibly quiet, but her piercing eyes were highly sharp, intensely searching him. Ethan slowly, heavily exhaled, his massive hands tightly clenched completely around the warm cup. Every single damn day, he admitted brokenly. I think deeply about the agonizing nights I violently missed fiercely holding them, about the bright mornings when I absolutely never saw their beautiful faces magically light up. I think entirely about you, about the massive, terrifying strength it aggressively took you to fiercely raise them completely alone, and I absolutely, violently hate the exact toxic man I was. He took a massive, deep breath. I would violently surrender absolutely everything I possess, every single pathetic dollar, every single elite corporate deal, if I could only magically change that exactly one catastrophic choice. But I absolutely cannot. Absolutely all I can do now is fiercely be exactly here, however you will graciously allow me. Catherine's eyes beautifully softened, although hot tears had absolutely remained highly visible there. You absolutely cannot magically undo it. You absolutely cannot violently erase the massive pain. But I vividly see the exact beautiful way they lovingly look directly at you now. The exact way they actively, eagerly wait perfectly at the window, exactly when you are incredibly elegant. She swallowed incredibly hard. I vividly see the exact way you have completely miraculously changed, Ethan. And perhaps, just perhaps, we can finally stop aggressively living entirely in exactly what tragically was, and fiercely begin to actively try to beautifully build something entirely brand new. Her beautiful voice violently cracked slightly entirely at the absolute end, and Ethan aggressively reached completely across the small table, his massive hand violently trembling entirely as it hovered highly hesitantly, completely over hers, before she finally, beautifully, allowed him to gently touch it. It absolutely wasn't complete, total forgiveness. Not yet. But it was a highly fragile, incredibly real, massive bridge. And entirely for him. It was absolutely, perfectly enough. The ultimate surrender. The chaotic, beautiful weeks that aggressively followed miraculously brought highly small, but incredibly profound changes. Catherine graciously allowed him to happily pick the tiny girls up directly from preschool, to joyfully join them entirely for warm family dinners, to proudly sit entirely at the absolute head of a small table that he had once violently, arrogantly lost completely by his own toxic choice. He heavily, awkwardly learned exactly how to flawlessly braid their long hair. His massive, clumsy hands, highly struggling entirely, while the identical twins laughed hysterically and aggressively corrected him. He accidentally burned sweet pancakes entirely on bright Sunday mornings, completely filling the small kitchen entirely with thick smoke and loud, pure laughter. And he sat incredibly patiently, completely, through their highly elaborate plastic tea parties, intensely listening entirely to every single highly nonsensical word, exactly as if every single one were absolutely sacred. The significantly more massive time he happily spent completely with them, the significantly more he profoundly, deeply realized that true absolute wealth was absolutely not found entirely in the massive, towering skyscrapers he arrogantly owned, but entirely in the pure warmth of their absolute trust, the high security of their pure laughter, and the highly cautious but completely undeniable, deep affection entirely in Catherine's beautiful eyes. One warm evening, exactly as the bright twilight beautifully stretched completely across the massive sky, Ethan stood happily entirely in the small garden. Anna and Grace fiercely clinging entirely to his massive hands, their tiny, bright voices aggressively urging him to happily chase them completely across the green lawn. Catherine quietly watched entirely from the wooden porch, her beautiful lips softly curved entirely into a highly faint, beautiful smile that profoundly spoke entirely of something massive she had heavily held back for an incredibly long time, but absolutely could no longer stubbornly deny. He completely stopped for one highly massive moment, intensely looking directly at her, and entirely in that piercing gaze, he vividly saw absolutely not only the beautiful woman he had violently lost, but the massive, incredible life he had been way too incredibly, arrogantly blind to fiercely embrace. He profoundly understood right then that true absolute redemption absolutely wasn't entirely about magically erasing the highly toxic past, but entirely about fiercely, bravely choosing completely differently every single beautiful day. It was entirely about flawlessly showing up, about fiercely loving completely without toxic fear, about aggressively proving completely with absolute actions exactly what empty words could absolutely never, ever fully repair. That exact night, when the tiny girls finally, peacefully fell asleep, Catherine softly whispered the exact, heavy words he had agonizingly, desperately longed to clearly hear, although they absolutely did not come exactly as a massive, grand declaration, but exactly as something incredibly quiet and brutally honest. You are absolutely not the exact same toxic man I once intensely knew. You are significantly, infinitely better now, and perhaps that is absolutely enough entirely for us to bravely try again. Ethan tightly closed his eyes. His massive chest violently tightened entirely with a highly explosive mixture of pure relief and absolute, unadulterated gratitude so incredibly overwhelming that he literally could not physically speak. He simply, fiercely nodded, his massive hand gently finding hers entirely beneath the small table, their fingers fiercely intertwining exactly as if they had been agonizingly waiting entirely for agonizing years, entirely for that exactly one beautiful moment. For the absolute first time in his entire life, Ethan profoundly felt that his massive empire was absolutely not completely built entirely of cold glass and hard steel, but entirely of warm flesh and pure, unbreakable love. Highly fragile, but completely, utterly unbreakable, entirely, in its own beautiful way. He had violently lost absolutely everything exactly once before, but highly massive benevolent destiny had miraculously given him an absolute second chance, and this time he would absolutely not violently squander it. As he sat peacefully right there, intimately listening entirely to the incredibly quiet, rhythmic breathing of his beautiful daughters entirely in the exact next room, and the highly constant, beautiful presence of Catherine directly by his side. He profoundly understood that this was the absolute, only massive victory that truly mattered, and for the absolute first time in his entire, massive life, Ethan Reiner, the terrifying man whom the entire elite world had aggressively called unbreakable, finally, profoundly knew exactly what it truly meant to be absolutely, entirely complete. What an incredible journey of forgiveness, growth, and true redemption. What was your favorite moment of Ethan trying to win his family back? Could you have ever forgiven him like Catherine did? Let us know in the comments below. If you felt every single emotion in this story, please smash that like button, share it with someone you love, and subscribe to our channel for more life-changing stories. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.